Hello, my name is Professor Cox. I am the digital avatar of Stan Cox. Stan personally writes all the scripts I present. The Middle Ages. The middle of what? I have long been fascinated by the historical period referred to as the Middle Ages, or the medieval era, for many reasons. One of which is that there seems to be no clear consensus of what the period is comprised of historically, politically, ideologically, and spiritually, or the chronological boundaries that define it. What becomes evident fairly quickly is that there is a great deal of subjectivity in the creation and application of these terms and what they mean. The only clear consensus occurs among those with particularly defined worldviews or academic political ideologies and agendas. But let's back up for a moment. Are any classifications of historical periods or eras carved in historical stone? Or are they simply conventions that make discussing human history and culture more convenient to those attempting to understand and describe them? Peter Gay observed, "The division of history into epochs is an act of convenience, not truth." Michel Foucault states even more eloquently, "The categorization of history into ages or eras is an illusion that serves narrative convenience, not reality." And even more illustratively, Eric Hobsbawm implies, "There are no clean breaks in history, only messy transitions." So where does this designation of Middle Ages originate? Its use begins among Renaissance humanists in the 14th and 15th centuries, especially in Italy. The first recorded use of the Latin media tempestas, translated middle time, was by Leonardo Bruni in this time frame. These scholarly and artistic humanists considered themselves to be the rediscovery and rebirth of classical antiquity, and they saw the period between the end of the Roman Empire and themselves to be more or less an unenlightened buffer zone. As for the term Renaissance, meaning rebirth, it doesn't show up until the early 19th century. The broadest parameters of the medieval period usually begin with the fall of Rome in 410 AD and the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks. From my perspective, there is an ideological break with the period in which Europe was formed that begins with Pico della Mirandola's restatement of the sophist Pythagoras' contention that man is the measure of all things. The peoples of the so-called Middle Ages were gloriously human, but they were certainly not humanists. And it is humanism that defines the following historical periods more than anything else. Needless to say, when the Visigoths sacked Rome, those residents at the time didn't conclude, "Oh no, there goes classical antiquity. We are now stuck in the Middle Ages." In fact, there is no indication that the Western world perceived itself to be the middle of anything at this time. So we are looking at a period of almost 1,000 years in which Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire gradually morphs into what we today call Europe. To describe a millennium which encompassed tremendous diversity geographically, politically, linguistically, and culturally, with a single designated title, seems in many respects absurd. Nevertheless, there are some unifying threads that create a sense of continuity and integrity. Jacob Burckhardt, in his work, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, indicated that the medieval worldview was dominated by Christian faith, collective identity, and spiritual values, whereas the Renaissance was all about individualism, secularism, and modern consciousness. Where Renaissance thinkers completely missed the boat was in presenting the medieval era as making a break with classical traditions and learning. One simply needed to mention the poet in medieval times to hear it as referring to Virgil. By the end of the period, to refer to the philosopher automatically designated Aristotle. In fact, one of the wonders of this collective consciousness was how they synthesized the culture, literature, philosophy, and educational values of the Greek and Roman world with a Western Christian worldview. This is wonderfully articulated and illustrated in C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, an introduction to medieval and Renaissance literature. The homogeneous culture of the period recognized a spiritual, poetic, and deeply spiritual cosmology, the influence of which still creates echoes in the digital age. Lewis's basic message is that although diverse, medieval culture was defined by a unifying cosmology which helped them understand the nature of God's creation and their place in it. T.S. Eliot is famous for his statement, "Dante and Shakespeare divide the modern world between them. There is no third." I see no coherent argument against this statement, but for all practical purposes, both of these poets are 1,000 times more products of the medieval world than they are of the Renaissance. So there is a significant divergence between the medieval and modern worlds. But it is the modernists who are much more interested in stating their case than those of us who still hear the music of the spheres. It was Edward Gibbon who referred to the period prior to the Renaissance as the Dark Ages, in order to contrast it with his immersion in the period often referred to as the Enlightenment. I'll take the former over latter any day. As a medievalist, I would refer to the Enlightenment as being, in many respects, the dark night of the soul. I will address these thoughts further in future. A convincing refutation of Gibbon's views can be found in the book The Bright Ages, A New History of Medieval Europe by Matthew Gabriel and David M. Perry. Thanks for taking the time to view this presentation. There is much more to come on a variety of topics. I hope you will join me on this journey.